powerful man thought he could intimidate Sylvester Stallone. He made one big mistake. Stay tuned to find out how the Hollywood legend handled the situation like a true champion. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable stories about your favorite stars. Los Angeles had a way of shifting from glamorous to dangerous in the blink of an eye. One moment, you're enjoying a quiet dinner. The next, trouble finds you. Sylvester Stallone had seen both sides of this city. He knew its lights and shadows better than most. Tonight, he was just a man grabbing a meal. A simple plan. An old Italian restaurant, a place he'd been coming to for years. No red carpets, no flashing cameras. Just a dark leather booth, a glass of red wine, and the comforting scent of garlic and slow-cooked marinara. The kind of place where the waiters knew your name, where they brought out your favorite dish before you even ordered. But something was off. The restaurant had gone quieter. Not silent, but tense. Conversations slowed, laughter faded, and even the clinking of silverware seemed softer. Stallone noticed it before he even turned his head. A shift in the room, a ripple through the air. Then the door opened. A man walked in, moving like he owned the ground beneath him. Not a Hollywood star, not a businessman, but someone who carried a different kind of weight. Someone whose power didn't come from money or fame, but from fear. Vinnie Marzano. A name that meant something in certain circles. He wasn't just another tough guy. He was the kind of man people whispered about. The kind who could make problems disappear, or create them. And right now, he was walking straight towards Stallone. Two men in tailored suits flanked him, their movements careful, controlled. Professionals. The kind who didn't need to flex their muscles to prove they were dangerous. They just were. Vinnie reached Stallone's table and, without asking, slid into the seat across from him. "Hey, Rocky." His voice was smooth, almost friendly. "Almost. Mind if I join you?" Stallone took a slow sip of his wine before setting the glass down. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at Vinnie. The man smiled like they were old friends catching up. Then he leaned in slightly, resting his thick hands on the table. His fingers were adorned with heavy gold rings, each one catching the dim restaurant light. "We gotta talk, Sly." Stallone didn't flinch. He'd been in 100 negotiations, 1,000 tense moments. He knew the value of silence. Vinnie smirked, glancing around as if admiring the place. Then he let out a short chuckle. "I gotta say, you've been doing real good for yourself. Big movies, big money. You work hard, I respect that. But here's the thing, Hollywood's a rough town. Lots of ups and downs. Sometimes, people need a little insurance." His tone stayed light, conversational. But the weight behind the words was clear. Stallone finally spoke, his voice even. "You think I need insurance?" Vinnie chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, not insurance. More like support. See, me and my guys, we make sure things stay smooth. No surprises. No headaches. And for guys like you, that's valuable." He reached into his jacket, pulled out a small folded piece of paper, and placed it on the table. Then, with two fingers, he slid it towards Stallone. "This is what you owe. Call it an investment. A partnership." Stallone looked down but didn't touch the paper. He already knew what it was. A number. An amount someone like Vinnie expected him to pay. He exhaled slowly, then leaned back, his eyes locked onto Vinnie's. "Vinnie," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't owe nobody nothing." The smile on Vinnie's face twitched. It didn't disappear completely, but it changed. Became something sharper. His men, still standing, shifted slightly. Not aggressive, not yet. But ready. "Sly," Vinnie said, his tone just a little colder. "I like you. I really do. That's why I'm making this easy. But let me give you some advice. Nobody says no to me." Stallone didn't blink. He just reached for his wine, took another sip, and set the glass down gently. Then, finally, he picked up the folded paper and opened it. He looked at the number. Then, in one smooth motion, he ripped it in half. Vinnie's eyes flickered. His men tensed. Stallone placed the torn pieces on the table, then leaned in just a little, his voice still calm. "That's my answer." Silence. The whole restaurant was frozen. No one moved. No one even breathed. Vinnie's jaw tightened. His fingers tapped against the table, slow, deliberate. His men were waiting for a signal. A nod. A word. But Stallone didn't look nervous. Didn't look scared. He just sat there. And then, in a voice just above a whisper, he said something that made the entire restaurant go even quieter. And in that moment, everything changed. The restaurant was silent. Every eye was on Stallone and Vinnie. The air was thick with unspoken tension, the kind that made people hold their breath without realizing it. Stallone had just ripped the note in half, and now he was looking straight at Vinnie, completely unfazed. The kind of look that said, "I faced worse than you." Vinnie's fingers drummed on the table, slow and deliberate. His smile had faded, but there was something else in his eyes now. Curiosity. This wasn't the reaction he was expecting. Most men would have swallowed their pride, paid up, maybe even apologized. But Stallone wasn't most men. Vinnie exhaled through his nose, then leaned forward slightly. His voice was quiet now, controlled, but there was an edge to it. "You got guts, slide out, I'll give you that." He reached out, picking up one of the torn halves of the paper. He twirled it between his fingers, almost amused. "But let me ask you something," Vinnie continued. "You really think this is how you want to play it? 'Cause I promise you, it ain't gonna go like one of your movies." Stallone gave him a small smirk, tilting his head slightly. "Yeah?" His voice was calm, steady. "And how do you think it's gonna go?" Vinnie chuckled, shaking his head. "Sly, you ever hear about my guy, Lenny Ricci?" Stallone didn't respond, so Vinnie continued. "Lenny thought he was tough. Thought he could say no to me. One day, he wakes up, finds out his whole life just ain't the same no more." Vinnie made a slow, lazy gesture with his hand, as if brushing something off the table. "Gone everything." His voice stayed light, almost casual. But his eyes, cold as steel. Stallone didn't flinch, didn't react. Instead, he picked up his wine glass again, took a sip, and set it down. Then he leaned forward, his voice quiet but sharp as a blade. "Vinnie," he said, "you ever hear about my guy, Apollo Creed?" Vinnie blinked. His men exchanged confused glances. "I don't know what the hell you're talking about," Vinnie muttered, his patience wearing thin. Stallone smirked. "Apollo Creed. The best. The champ. Fast, strong. Thought nobody could touch him." He leaned in a little more. "Then one day, he steps into the ring with a guy from the streets. A nobody. Someone he thought wasn't worth worrying about." Vinnie's jaw tightened. He didn't like where this was going. "You know what happened next?" Stallone continued. No one answered. The whole restaurant was listening. Stallone tapped the table lightly with one finger. That nobody beat him. Vinnie exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. "This ain't the movies, Sly." "No," Stallone said. "It ain't. But see, the thing is," he motioned around the restaurant. "You walked in here thinking I was just some actor. Some rich guy who'd roll over 'cause you snapped your fingers." He took another sip of wine, then set the glass down gently. "But you made one mistake." Vinnie raised an eyebrow. "Yeah? What's that?" Stallone smiled. "You thought I was scared of you." Silence. Vinnie's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. A flicker of something unreadable. His men, still standing behind him, shifted slightly. They weren't sure what to do. Stallone kept going. "Now, don't get me wrong, Vinnie. You got a reputation. People fear you. And that works, for most guys. But me?" He shrugged. "I ain't most guys." A beat of silence. Then, Stallone did something that nobody in the restaurant expected. He leaned back in his seat, crossed his arms, and chuckled. Not a nervous laugh. Not a fake one. A real, genuine, almost amused laugh. Vinnie didn't like that. "You think this is funny?" His voice was quieter now, but there was something dangerous underneath. Stallone shook his head, still smiling. "No, I think it's interesting." He gestured toward Vinnie's two men. "I mean, look at your guys. They're waiting for the signal. Ready to make a move, but you haven't given it." He picked up a piece of bread from the table, broke it in half, and took a bite. He chewed, swallowed, then wiped his hands on a napkin. "You know why?" Vinnie just stared. "Because you know if you try something here," Stallone continued, motioning around, "this place turns into a circus. Cops, witnesses, cameras. Bad for business, huh?" Vinnie's fingers tightened into a fist. Stallone nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's what I thought." Another long silence. Then, Vinnie did something nobody expected. He leaned back, exhaled, laughed. A slow, low chuckle. "You're good, Sly," he admitted, shaking his head. "Real good." He picked up one of the torn pieces of paper, looked at it, then let it fall back onto the table. Stallone just smirked. Vinnie exhaled again, then stood up, adjusting his suit. You got lucky tonight. Stallone tilted his head. Now that I just knew what game you were playing. Vinnie stared at him for a long moment. Then he gave a slow nod. This ain't over, he muttered. And with that, he turned and walked away. His men hesitated for half a second, then followed. The restaurant, which had been dead silent moments ago, seemed to exhale all at once. People shifted, whispered, started eating again. But Stallone? He just reached for his wine and took another sip. Like nothing had happened. But he knew one thing. This wasn't over. The restaurant was still buzzing, though no one dared to speak too loudly. The moment Vinnie Marzano and his men had walked out, the tension that had gripped the place finally started to ease. But Stallone knew better than to think it was over. Guys like Vinnie didn't just walk away. They planned. They waited. Stallone took one last sip of his wine, then casually waved over the waiter. Tell Luigi I'm gonna need the check, he said, his voice as relaxed as if nothing had happened. The waiter, a thin man with nervous eyes, nodded quickly and scurried toward the back. Stallone could feel eyes on him. Some of the diners were still whispering, stealing glances in his direction. They were waiting to see what would happen next. But Stallone wasn't worried. At least, not yet. The waiter returned with the check, but before Stallone could reach for his wallet, the man hesitated. Ah, Mr. Stallone. Luigi says this one's on the house. Stallone smirked. The old man must have been watching. Tell him I appreciate it. The waiter nodded and rushed away. Stallone took his time standing up, adjusting his jacket, and then, without looking back, he walked out the door. The night air was crisp. Los Angeles never really got cold, but there was a slight breeze that carried the scent of distant car exhaust and the occasional waft of fresh bread from the bakery down the street. Stallone's car was parked just a block away. He had barely taken 5 steps when he noticed it. A black SUV with tinted windows, engine idling. Not a coincidence. He kept walking. Slow, steady. Like he hadn't noticed. The SUV's engine revved slightly, and just as he expected, it started to roll forward. Keeping pace with him, Stallone stopped at the corner, pretending to adjust his sleeve, giving himself a second to assess the situation. Then, the passenger side window rolled down. Vinnie Marzano. Only this time, he wasn't smiling. Get in, Vinnie said. Stallone turned his head slightly, looking at him through the open window. Nah, he said casually. I think I'll walk. Vinnie exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You know, I really don't like repeating myself. The back door of the SUV opened. One of Vinnie's guys, a big guy, probably 6'4", built like a truck, stepped out. He wasn't wearing a suit this time. Black jeans, black leather jacket. A guy dressed for work. Stallone didn't move. Didn't even shift his stance. I ain't getting in the car, Vinnie, he said. His voice was calm, but there was a steel edge underneath. The big guy took a step closer. Boss ain't a skin. Stallone turned fully now, facing him. He let out a small breath, as if he were annoyed. You got a name, big guy? He asked. The man hesitated for a second. That wasn't the response he had expected. Tony, he grunted. Stallone nodded. Tony, let me ask you something. You ever hear of Ivan Drago? Tony squinted. What? Ivan Drago, Stallone repeated. Big guy. Russian. Looked a lot like you. Stronger, though. Tony frowned, confused. Stallone smiled. I knocked his ass out. Before Tony could react, Stallone moved. A quick step forward, not away, but toward. That alone threw Tony off. Guys like him expected people to back up, to flinch. But Stallone? He went straight in. A sharp elbow to the ribs. Fast, brutal. Tony grunted in pain, stumbling back a step. Not much, but enough. Enough for Stallone to follow up with a quick jab. Not to the face, but to the throat. Controlled. Precise. Just enough to shock him. Tony gasped, instinctively bringing his hands to his throat. By the time he recovered, Stallone was already gone. The moment his feet hit the pavement, Stallone moved fast. Not panicked, not running, but with purpose. He darted between parked cars, cutting through the narrow alley behind the restaurant. He could hear the SUV screeching as it made a sharp turn, trying to follow. He needed a plan. Fast then, he spotted it. An old delivery truck, still running, keys in the ignition. The driver had just stepped out, lighting a cigarette. He was only a few feet away. Stallone didn't hesitate. He jumped into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and hit the gas. The truck lurched forward just as the SUV rounded the corner. They saw him. Vinnie's guy in the passenger seat pointed. "That's him. Go!" The SUV roared forward. Stallone kept his focus on the road. The truck was old, slow, but it was big. He had an advantage. He could take a hit. The SUV pulled up alongside him, trying to force him toward the curb. Stallone saw it coming. He yanked the wheel hard to the left. Crash! The side of the truck slammed into the SUV, metal screeching against metal. The driver lost control for a second, swerving wildly. Stallone didn't wait. He floored it. Up ahead, a red light. A busy intersection. The SUV was still beside him, trying to recover. Stallone made his move. At the last second, he yanked the wheel right, hard. The truck swung wide, blocking the SUV's path just as the light turned green for cross-traffic. The SUV's driver slammed the brakes. Too late. Honk, screech, bam. A sedan T-boned the SUV, sending it spinning into the intersection. Stallone didn't wait to see what happened next. He jumped out of the truck and disappeared into the night. Vinnie had just learned a valuable lesson. Sylvester Stallone? He didn't scare easy. Stallone moved through the back streets of Los Angeles like a ghost. His pulse was steady, his breathing controlled. He had been in enough fights, inside and outside the ring, to know panic was the enemy. He had just sent Vinnie Marzano's SUV spinning into an intersection, and that meant one thing: this wasn't over. Guys like Vinnie didn't take losses lightly. They didn't shrug things off and walk away. They hit back. Hard. Stallone needed to get ahead of this. He turned down a quiet alley, emerging onto a side street, and hailed a cab. As soon as he got in, he gave the driver an address, but not home. No, this was a different kind of night. He needed to see an old friend. The cab rolled up to a small boxing gym in South L.A. Wasn't flashy, wasn't the kind of place tourists visited. It was real. Raw, the kind of gym where you learned the hard way whether you belonged in a ring or not. Stallone pushed open the heavy steel door, stepping inside. The air smelled of sweat and leather, the rhythmic sound of speed bags echoing through the space. And then he saw him, Mickey Iron Mick Romano, an old-school fighter, a guy Stallone had known for decades. Tough, smart, and most importantly, connected in ways that mattered. Mick was wrapping a young boxer's hands when he noticed Stallone standing in the doorway. He smirked. "You look like hell." Stallone chuckled, stepping forward. "Yeah, well, been one of those nights." Mick finished tying the wrap, gave the kid a pat on the shoulder, then waved Stallone toward the office in the back. Inside, the walls were lined with old fight posters, some yellowed with age. A small desk sat in the middle of the room, cluttered with papers, boxing gloves, and a half-eaten sandwich. Mick leaned back in his chair. "All right, talk to me." Stallone exhaled. "Vinnie Marzano." Mick's face changed. "Just a little. That's a name I haven't heard in a while," he muttered. "What the hell did you do?" Stallone smirked. "Told him no." Mick let out a low whistle. "You always did like making life harder than it needs to be." "Yeah, well, I wasn't about to start paying for protection I don't need." Mick nodded slowly, drumming his fingers on the desk. "You know how this goes. Sly guys like Vinnie don't just walk away. They come back. Meaner." Stallone crossed his arms. "That's why I'm here." Mick studied him for a moment, then sighed. "You want advice? Lay low. Let him cool off." Stallone shook his head. "Not my style." Mick smirked. "Yeah, figured." He reached into a drawer, pulling out a small burner phone, tossing it on the desk. "What's this?" Stallone asked. "A direct line to a guy who might be able to help. Someone who doesn't like Vinnie any more than you do." Stallone picked up the phone, flipping it open. Only one number was saved in it. "Who is he?" Mick leaned forward. "Just call him. He'll explain." Stallone hesitated for half a second, then pressed call. The phone rang. Once, twice. Then a deep, gravelly voice answered. "Took you long enough." Somewhere across the city, Vinnie Marzano was fuming. His SUV was wrecked. His driver was in the hospital. And worst of all, Stallone had walked away clean. Vinnie sat in a private club, surrounded by his most trusted men. A glass of whiskey rested on the table in front of him, untouched. His fingers tapped against the rim. No one spoke. Not until Vinnie did. Finally, he exhaled. "I want him," he said. His voice was calm, but the rage underneath was clear. "I want Sly Stallone found and brought to me. Tonight." His men nodded. They didn't need to be told twice. Vinnie leaned back in his chair, watching the ice melt in his glass. Sylvester Stallone thought this was over. It wasn't. Back at the gym, Stallone ended the call and set the phone down. Mick raised an eyebrow. So? Stallone rubbed his chin. He says he wants to meet. Now. Mick sighed. You sure about this? Stallone smirked. You know me. Mick shook his head. Yeah, and that's what worries me. Stallone grabbed his jacket. I'll be fine. Mick exhaled. You know where to find me if you ain't. Stallone gave him a nod, then walked out the door. He didn't know exactly who he was about to meet, but something told him this was about to get a whole lot more interesting. The streets of Los Angeles were never truly quiet, even in the dead of night. Neon lights flickered, cars rumbled in the distance, and somewhere, a siren wailed. But as Sylvester Stallone walked toward the meeting spot, everything else faded into the background. He wasn't thinking about his career, his wealth, or his fame. This wasn't about movies. This was about a man who tried to push him, and now, he had to push back. The address Mick had given him led to an abandoned warehouse near the docks. The kind of place where deals were made, where problems disappeared. The kind of place where guys like Vinnie felt at home. Stallone wasn't intimidated. He had grown up fighting in places like this, different city, same rules. As he approached the entrance, a figure stepped out of the shadows. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark suit, but not the polished kind. The practical kind. The kind worn by men who handled business the old-fashioned way. You Stallone? The man asked, his voice deep, steady. Stallone gave a slow nod. That's what they tell me. The man smirked. Follow me. He turned and led Stallone inside. The warehouse was dimly lit, filled with crates and the faint scent of oil and rust. In the center of the space, a single table stood, and behind it, the man he had come to meet. Dressed in a simple black shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal thick forearms covered in faded scars, the man barely looked up as Stallone approached. He was studying something on the table. A half-smoked cigar rested beside him. Stallone recognized him immediately. Frankie Moretti. If Vinnie Marzano was bad news, Frankie was worse. The difference? Vinnie was a businessman who played at being a gangster. Frankie? He was the real thing. Moretti finally looked up. His dark eyes studied Stallone carefully, then he motioned to the seat across from him. Sit. Stallone sat. Frankie leaned back. So, you got yourself a problem with Vinnie? Stallone smirked. Seems that way. Frankie nodded slowly. Yet I heard about what happened. About the restaurant. The SUV. Even heard about what you did to Tony. Stallone shrugged. Didn't like the way he was standing. Frankie chuckled, shaking his head. You're a tough guy. Huh? Stallone didn't answer. Frankie took a slow breath. Here's the thing. Vinnie's got power, but only the power people give him. You got something he doesn't. Stallone raised an eyebrow. Yeah? What's that? Frankie smiled. The public. Stallone narrowed his eyes slightly. Frankie leaned forward. Vinnie operates in the dark. Fear, intimidation. That's his game. But you? He pointed at Stallone. You ain't just some rich guy. You ain't just some actor. You're a face people know. A name they respect. He smirked. That makes you dangerous. Stallone remained silent, letting Frankie continue. I don't like Vinnie. Never have, Frankie said, tapping his fingers against the table. And truth is, I wouldn't mind seeing him lose. Stallone leaned back slightly. You offering me something, Frankie? Frankie exhaled through his nose. I'm offering you a way out. One that don't end with you looking over your shoulder the rest of your life. Stallone tilted his head. I'm listening. Frankie nodded. Good, 'cause this is how it's gonna go. Meanwhile, Vinnie Marzano was done waiting. He sat in the back of a blacked-out sedan, parked a block away from Stallone's house. His men were ready. Guns loaded. Plans in place. Slice got guts, Vinnie admitted, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand. But guts only get you so far. The man in the driver's seat nodded. You want us to move now? Vinnie exhaled, considering. Not yet. He looked at his watch. 2:37 a.m. Give it another 20 minutes, he muttered. Let's see if our boy tries to make a move. What he didn't know, Stallone already had. Back at the warehouse, Stallone listened as Frankie laid it out. Vinnie's got weaknesses, Frankie said. And I'm gonna hand you one. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small flash drive, and slid it across the table. Stallone raised an eyebrow. What's this? Frankie smirked. Let's just say, it's enough to make Vinnie disappear. Stallone studied him carefully. And you're just giving this to me? Out of kindness? Frankie chuckled. Let's just say, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Stallone picked up the flash drive. This better be real. Frankie's smirk faded. Oh, it's real. He stood up, signaling the meeting was over. Now go in this, Sly. Stallone pocketed the flash drive, gave a small nod, then turned and walked out. It was time to finish what Vinnie started. Vinnie Marzano sat in his car, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. 3 a.m. Where the hell is he? He muttered, growing impatient. He was ready to end this, to crush Stallone once and for all. Then, his phone rang. Unknown number. Vinnie frowned, glancing at his men before answering. Marzano, he growled. A familiar voice came through the line. You really think you can play by your own rules and everyone else just has to be afraid? Vinnie's grip on the phone tightened. Stallone, where the hell are you? You son of a... he hissed, scanning the dark streets around him. Oh, I'm not where you're looking, Stallone said, his voice calm, almost amused. But you know who is looking for you right now? Silence. Then, beep beep. Vinnie received a message. He opened it, and his heart dropped. A scanned document. Wire fraud. Bribery. Money laundering. Evidence that could bury him for years. And one more message. This isn't your game anymore, Vinnie. By morning, the cops will have all of this, unless you disappear. For good. Vinnie's rage exploded. You don't know who you're messing with. He snarled. But Stallone just chuckled. Low, confident. No, Vinnie. You don't get it. I already won. Click. The call ended. Vinnie slammed his phone against the dashboard, his men waiting in tense silence. He had only one choice left, and by sunrise, Vinnie Marzano had vanished from Los Angeles, forever. The next morning, Stallone stepped out of his favorite cafe, sipping his coffee. The sun was rising, casting golden light over the city. He exhaled slowly, then smirked to himself. Another day, another fight, and another win for the underdog.